26. She was twice Lolita's age and 3/4 of mine, a very slight, dark-haired, pale-skinned adult, weighing 105 pounds, with charmingly asymmetrical eyes, and angular, rapidly sketched profile, and a most appealing answer to her supple back. I think she had some Spanish or Babylonian blood. I picked her up one depraved May evening somewhere between Montreal and New York, or more narrowly, between Toylestown and Blake, at a darkishly burning bar under the sign of the Tiger Mouth, where she was amiably drunk. She insisted we had gone to school together, and she placed her trembling little hand on my ape paw. My senses were very slightly stirred, but I decided to give her a try. I did, and adopted her as a constant companion. She was so kind, was Rita, such a good sport, that I dare say she would have given herself to any pathetic creature or fallacy, an old broken tree or a bereaved porcupine, out of sheer chumminess and compassion. When I first met her, she had but recently divorced her third husband, and a little more recently had been abandoned by her seventh cavalier servant. The others, the mutables, were too numerous and mobile to tabulate. Her brother was, in no doubt still is, a prominent, pasty-faced, suspenders and painted tie-wearing politician, mayor and booster of his ball-playing, Bible-reading, grain-handling hometown. For the last 8 years he had been paying his great little sister several $100s per month under the stringent condition that she would never enter great little Grain Ball City. She told me, with wails of wonder, that for some goddamn reason every new boyfriend of hers would first of all take her Grain Ball ward. It was a fatal attraction, and before she knew what was what, she would find herself sucked into the lunar orbit of the town, and would be following the floodlit drive that encircled it, going round and round, as she phrased it, like a goddamn mulberry moth. She had a natty little coupe, and in it we traveled to California so as to give my venerable vehicle a rest. Her natural speed was 90. Dear Rita. We cruised together for 2 dim years, from summer 1950 to summer 1952, and she was the sweetest, simplest, gentlest, dumbest Rita imaginable. In comparison to her, Valika was a Schlegel, and Charlotte a Hegel. There is no earthly reason why I should dally with her in the margin of this sinister memoir, but let me say, hi, Rita, wherever you are, drunk or hangoverish, Rita, hi, that she was the most soothing, the most comprehending companion that I ever had, and certainly saved me from the madhouse. I told her I was trying to trace a girl and plug that girl's bully. Rita solemnly approved of the plan, and in the course of some investigation she undertook on her own, without really knowing a thing, around San Humbertino, got entangled with a pretty awful crook herself. I had the devil of a time retrieving her, used and bruised but still cocky. Then one day she proposed playing Russian roulette with my sacred automatic. I said you couldn't, it was not a revolver, and we struggled for it, until at last it went off, touching off a very thin and very comical spurt of hot water from the hole it made in the wall of the cabin room. I remember her shrieks of laughter. The oddly prepubescent curve of her back, her ricey skin, her slow languorous columbine kisses kept me from mischief. It is not the artistic aptitudes that are secondary sexual characters, as some shams and shamans have said. It is the other way around. Sex is but the ancilla of art. One rather mysterious spree that had interesting repercussions, I must notice. I had abandoned the search. The fiend was either in Tartary or burning away in my cerebellum, the flames fanned by my fancy and grief, but certainly not having Dolores Haze play champion tennis on the Pacific coast. One afternoon, on our way back east, in a hideous hotel, the kind where they hold conventions and where labeled, fat, pink men stagger around, all first names and business and booze, dear Rita and I awoke to find a third in our room, a blonde, almost albino, young fellow with white eyelashes and large transparent ears, whom neither Rita nor I recalled having ever seen in our sad lives. Sweating in thick dirty underwear, and with old army boots on, he lay snoring on the double bed beyond my chaste Rita. One of his front teeth was gone, amber pustules grew on his forehead. Rita enveloped her sinuous nudity in my raincoat. The first thing at hand, I slipped on a pair of candy-striped drawers, and we took stock of the situation. 5 glasses had been used, which in the way of clues, was an embarrassment of riches. The door was not properly closed. A sweater and a pair of shapeless tan pants lay on the floor. We shook their owner into miserable consciousness. He was completely amnesic. In an accent that Rita recognized as pure Brooklinese, he peevishly insinuated that somehow we had purloined his worthless identity. We rushed him into his clothes and left him at the nearest hospital, realizing on the way that somehow or other after forgotten gyrations, we were in Grain Ball. Half a year later Rita wrote the doctor for news. Jack Humbertson, as he had been tastelessly dubbed, was still isolated from his personal past. Onomosony, sweetest and most mischievous of muses. I would not have mentioned this incident had it not started a chain of ideas that resulted in my publishing in the Cantrip Review an essay on mimir and memory, in which I suggested among other things that seemed original and important to that splendid review's benevolent readers, a theory of perceptual time based on the circulation of the blood and conceptually depending, to fill up this nutshell, on the mind's being conscious not only of matter but also of its own self, thus creating a continuous spanning of 2 points, the storable future and the stored past. In result of this venture and in culmination of the impression made by my previous Tervux, I was called from New York, where Rita and I were living in a little flat with a view of gleaming children taking shower baths far below in a fountainous arbor of Central Park, to Cantrip College, 400 miles away, for 1 year. I lodged there, in special apartments for poets and philosophers, from September 1951 to June 1952. While Rita, whom I preferred not to display, vegetated somewhat indecorously, I am afraid, in a roadside inn where I visited her twice a week. Then she vanished more humanly than her predecessor had done. A month later I found her in the local jail. She was trosed in, had had her appendix removed, and managed to convince me that the beautiful bluish furs she had been accused of stealing from a Mrs. Roland McCrum had really been a spontaneous, if somewhat alcoholic, gift from Roland himself. I succeeded in getting her out without appealing to her touchy brother, and soon afterwards we drove back to Central Park West, by way of Bryceland, where we had stopped for a few hours the year before. A curious urge to relive my stay there with Lolita had got hold of me. I was entering a phase of existence where I had given up all hope of tracing her kidnapper and her. I now attempted to fall back on old settings in order to save what still could be saved in the way of souvenir. Souvenir came Evux too? Autumn was ringing in the air. To a postcard requesting twin beds, Professor Hamburg got a prompt expression of regret in reply. They were full up. They had one bathless basement room with 4 beds which they thought I would not want. Their note paper was headed, "The Enchanted Hunters near churches, no dogs, all legal beverages." I wondered if the last statement was true. All? Did they have, for instance, sidewalk grenadine? I also wondered if a hunter, enchanted or otherwise, would not need a pointer more than a pew, and with a spasm of pain I recalled a scene worthy of a great artist, petite nymphic groupie, but that silky cocker spaniel had perhaps been a baptized one. No, I felt I could not endure the throes of revisiting that lobby. There was a much better possibility of retrievable time elsewhere in soft, rich-colored, autumnal Bryceland. Leaving Rita in a bar, I made for the town library. A twittering spinster was only too glad to help me disinter mid-August 1947 from the bound Bryceland Gazette, and presently, in a secluded nook under a naked light, I was turning the enormous and fragile pages of a coffin-black volume almost as big as Lolita. Reader. Brooder. What a foolish Hamburg that Hamburg was. Since his supersensitive system was loath to face the actual scene, he thought he could at least enjoy a secret part of it, which reminds one of the 10th or 20th soldier in the raping queue who throws the girl's black shawl over her white face so as not to see those impossible eyes while taking his military pleasure in the sad, sacked village. What I lusted to get was the printed picture that had chanced to absorb my trespassing image while the Gazette's photographer was concentrating on Dr. Braddock and his group. Passionately I hoped to find preserved the portrait of the artist as a younger brute. An innocent camera catching me on my dark way to Lolita's bed. What a magnet for mnemosyne! I cannot well explain the true nature of that urge of mine. It was allied, I suppose, to that swooning curiosity which impels one to examine with a magnifying glass bleak little figures still life practically, and everybody about to throw up at an early morning execution, and the patient's expression impossible to make out in the print. Anyway, I was literally gasping for breath, and one corner of the Book of Doom kept stabbing me in the stomach while I scanned and skimmed. Brute Force and Possessed were coming on Sunday, the 24th, to both theaters. Mr. Purdom, independent tobacco auctioneer, said that ever since 1925 he had been an omen Fostum smoker. Husky Hank and his petite bride were to be the guests of Mr. and Mrs. Reginald G. Gore, 58-inch Keith Avenue. The size of certain parasites is 1/6 of the host. Dunkirk was fortified in the 10th century. Mrs. Socks, 39c. Saddle Oxford's 3.98 wine, quipped the author of Dark Age who refused to be photographed, may suit a Persian bubble bird, but I say give me rain, rain on the shingle roof for roses and inspiration every time. Dimples are caused by the adherence of the skin to the deeper tissues. Greeks repulse a heavy guerrilla assault and, at last, a little figure in white, and Dr. Braddock in black, but whatever spectral shoulder was brushing against his ample form nothing of myself could I make out. I went to find Rita who introduced me with her Van Trieste smile to a pocket-sized wizened truculently tight old man saying this was what was the name again, son ? A former schoolmate of hers. He tried to retain her, and in the slight scuffle that followed I heard my thumb against his hard head. In the silent painted part where I walked her and aired her a little, she sobbed and said I would soon leave her as everybody had, and I sang her a wistful French ballad, and strung together some fugitive rhymes to amuse her. The place was called Enchanted Hunters. Query, what Indian dies, Diana, did Thidel endorses to make of Picture Lake a very bloodbath of trees before the Blue Hotel? She said, why blue when it is white, why blue for heaven's sake? And started to cry again, and I marched her to the car, and we drove on to New York, and soon she was reasonably happy again high up in the haze on the little terrace of our flat. I notice I have somehow mixed up two events, my visit with Rita to Bryceland on our way to Carntrip, and our passing through Bryceland again on our way back to New York. But such suffusions of swimming colors are not to be disdained by the artist in recollection. 27. My letterbox in the entrance hall belonged to the type that allows one to glimpse something of its contents through a glassed slit. Several times already, a trick of harlequin light that fell through the glass upon an alien handwriting had twisted it into a semblance of Lolita's script, causing me almost to collapse as I leant against an adjacent turn, almost my own. Whenever that happened, whenever her lovely, childish scrawl was horribly transformed into the dull hand of one of my few correspondents, I used to recollect, with anguished amusement, the times in my trustful, pre-Dolorian past when I would be misled by a jewel-bright window opposite wherein my lurking eye, the ever-alert periscope of my shameful vice, would make out from afar a half-naked nymphette stilled in the act of combing her Alice in Wonderland hair. There was in the fiery phantasm a perfection which made my wild delight also perfect, just because the vision was out of reach, with no possibility of attainment to spoil it by the awareness of an appended taboo. Indeed, it may well be that the very attraction immaturity has for me lies not so much in the limpidity of pure young forbidden fairy child beauty as in the security of a situation where infinite perfections fill the gap between the little given and the great promised, the great rose grey never to be had. Msphenators. Hanging above blotched sunset and welling night, grinding my teeth, I would crowd all the demons of my desire against the railing of a throbbing balcony. It would be ready to take off in the apricot and black humid evening, did take off, whereupon the lighted image would move and even would revert to a rib, and there would be nothing in the window but an obese partly clad man reading the paper. Since I sometimes won the race between my fancy and nature's reality, the deception was bearable. Unbearable pain began when chance entered the fray and deprived me of the smile meant for me. Savez-vous que Dixon's ma petite était folle de vous? Said a woman I talked to at a tea in Paris, and the petite had just married, miles away, and I could not even remember if I had ever noticed her in that garden, next to those tennis courts, a dozen years before. And now likewise, the radiant for glimpse, the promise of reality, a promise not only to be simulated seductively but also to be nobly held. All this, chance denied me, chance and a change to smaller characters on the pale beloved writer's part. My fancy was both Proustianized and Procrustinized, for that particular morning, late in September 1952, as I had come down to grope for my mail, the dapper and bilious janitor with whom I was on execrable terms started to complain that a man who had seen Rita home recently had been sick like a dog on the front steps. In the process of listening to him and tipping him, and then listening to a revised and politer version of the incident, I had the impression that one of the two letters which that blessed mail brought was from Rita's mother, a crazy little woman, whom we had once visited on Cape Cod and who kept writing me to my various addresses, saying how wonderfully well matched her daughter and I were, and how wonderful it would be if we married. The other letter, which I opened and scanned rapidly in the elevator, was from John Farlow. I have often noticed that we are inclined to endow our friends with the stability of type that literary characters acquire in the reader's mind. No matter how many times we reopen King Lear, never shall we find the good king banging his tankard in high revelry, all woes forgotten, at a jolly reunion with all three daughters and their lapdogs. Never will end the rally, revived by the sympathetic salts in Flaubert's father's timely tear. Whatever revolution this or that popular character has gone through between the book covers, his fate is fixed in our minds, and, similarly, we expect our friends to follow this or that logical and conventional pattern we have fixed for them. Thus X will never compose the immortal music that would clash with the second-rate symphonies he has accustomed us to. Y will never commit murder. Under no circumstances can Z ever betray us. We have it all arranged in our minds, and the less often we see a particular person the more satisfying it is to check how obediently he conforms to our notion of him every time we hear of him. Any deviation in the fates we have ordained would strike us as not only anomalous but unethical. We would prefer not to have known at all our neighbor, the retired hot dog stand operator, if it turns out he has just produced the greatest book of poetry his age has seen. I am saying all this in order to explain how bewildered I was by Farlow's hysterical letter. I knew his wife had died, but I certainly expected him to remain, throughout a devout widowhood, the dull, sedate and reliable person he had always been. Now he wrote that after a brief visit to the U.S. he had returned to South America and had decided that whatever affairs he had controlled at Ramsdale he would hand over to Jack Windmuller of that town, a lawyer whom we both knew. He seemed particularly relieved to get rid of the Haze complications. He had married a Spanish girl. He had stopped smoking and had gained 30 pounds. She was very young and a ski champion. They were going to India for their honeymoon. Since he was building a family, as he put it, he would have no time henceforth for my affairs, which he termed very strange and very aggravating. Busybodies, a whole committee of them, it appeared, had informed him that the whereabouts of little Dolly Haze were unknown, and that I was living with a notorious divorcee in California. His father-in-law was a count, and exceedingly wealthy. The people who had been renting the Haze house for some years now wished to buy it. He suggested that I better produce Dolly quick. He had broken his leg. He enclosed a snapshot of himself and a brunette in white wool beaming at each other among the snows of Chile. I remember letting myself into my flat and starting to say, well, at least we shall now track them down, when the other letter began talking to me in a small matter-of-fact voice. Dear Dad, how's everything? I'm married. I'm going to have a baby. I guess he's going to be a big one. I guess he'll came right for Christmas. This is a hard letter to write. I'm going nuts because we don't have enough to pay our debts and get out of here. Dick is promised a big job in Alaska in his very specialized corner of the mechanical field, That's all I know about it, but it's really grand. Pardon me for withholding our home address, but you may still be mad at me, and Dick must not know. This town is something. You can't see the morons for the smog. Please do send us a check, Dad. We could manage with 300 or 400 or even less. Anything is welcome. You might sell my old things, because once we go there the dough will just start rolling in. Rit, please. I have gone through much sadness and hardship. Yours expecting, Dolly, Mrs. Richard F. Schiller. 28. I was again on the road, again at the wheel of the old blue sedan, again alone. Rita had still been dead to the world when I read that letter and fought the mountains of agony it raised within me. I had glanced at her as she smiled in her sleep and had kissed her on her moist brow, and had left her forever, with a note of tender adieu which I taped to her navel, otherwise she might not have found it. Alone, did I say? Pot out Thorn Fay. I had my little black chum with me, and as soon as I reached a secluded spot, I rehearsed Mr. Richard F. Schiller's violent death. I had found a very old and very dirty gray sweater of mine in the back of the car, and this I hung up on a branch, in a speechless glade, which I had reached by a wood road from the now remote highway. The carrying out of the sentence was a little marred by what seemed to me a certain stiffness in the play of the trigger, and I wondered if I should get some oil for the mysterious thing, but decided I had no time to spare. Back into the car went the old dead sweater, now with additional perforations, and having reloaded warm chum, I continued my journey. The letter was dated September 18, 1952, this was September 22, and the address she gave was General Delivery, Colmont, not Virginia, not Pa, not Tennessee, and not Colmont. Anyway, I have camouflaged everything, my love. Inquiries showed this to be a small industrial community some 800 miles from New York City. At first I planned to drive all day and all night, but then thought better of it and rested for a couple of hours around dawn in a motor courtroom, a few miles before reaching the town. I had made up my mind that the fiend, this Schiller, had been a car salesman who had perhaps got to know my Lolita by giving her a ride in Beardsley the day her bike blew a tire on the way to Miss Emperor, and that he had got into some trouble since then. The corpse of the executed sweater, no matter how I changed its contours as it lay on the back seat of the car, had kept revealing various outlines pertaining to Trap Schiller, the grossness and obscene bonhomie of his body. And to counteract this taste of coarse corruption, I resolved to make myself especially handsome and smart as I pressed home the nipple of my alarm clock before it exploded at the set hour of 6 a.m. Then, with the stern and romantic care of a gentleman about to fight a duel, I checked the arrangement of my papers, bathed and perfumed my delicate body, shaved my face and chest, selected a silk shirt and clean drawers, pulled on transparent taupe socks, and congratulated myself for having with me in my trunk some very exquisite clothes, a waistcoat with nacreous buttons, for instance, a pale cashmere tie, and so on. I was not able, alas, to hold my breakfast, but dismissed that physicality as a trivial contretemps, wiped my mouth with a gossamer handkerchief produced from my sleeve, and, with a blue block of ice for heart, a pill on my tongue, and solid death in my hip pocket, I stepped neatly into a telephone booth in Colmont, said its little door, and rang up the only Schiller Paul furniture to be found in the battered book. Horse Paul told me he did know a Richard, the son of a cousin of his, and his address was, let me see, 10 Killer Street. I am not going very far for my pseudonyms. Said the little door. At 10 Killer Street, a tenement house, I interviewed a number of dejected old people and 2 long-haired strawberry blonde incredibly grubby nymphets, rather abstractly, just for the heck of it. The ancient beast in me was casting about for some lightly clad child I might hold against me for a minute, after the killing was over and nothing mattered anymore, and everything was allowed. Yes, Dick Schiller had lived there, but had moved when he married. Nobody knew his address. They might know at the store, said a bass voice from an open manhole near which I happened to be standing with the 2 thin-armed, barefoot little girls and their dim grandmothers. I entered the wrong store and a wary old Negro shook his head even before I could ask anything. I crossed over to a bleak grocery and there, summoned by a customer at my request, a woman's voice from some wooden abyss in the floor, the manhole's counterpart, cried out, "Hunter Road, last house." Hunter Road was miles away, in an even more dismal district, all dump and ditch, and wormy vegetable garden, and shack, and grey drizzle, and red mud, and several smoking stacks in the distance. I stopped at the last house, a clapboard shack, with 2 or 3 similar ones farther away from the road and a waste of withered weeds all around. Sounds of hammering came from behind the house, and for several minutes I sat quite still in my old car, old and frail, at the end of my journey, at my grey goal, Finis, my friends, Finis, my friends. The time was around 2. My pulse was 41 minute and 100 the next. The drizzle crepitated against the hood of the car. My gun had migrated to my right trouser pocket. A nondescript cur came out from behind the house, stopped in surprise, and started good-naturedly woofing at me, his eyes slit, his shaggy belly all muddy, and then walked about a little and woofed once more. 29. I got out of the car and slammed its door. How matter-of-fact, how square that slam sounded in the void of the sunless day. "Woof," commented the dog perfunctorily. I pressed the bell button, it vibrated through my whole system. Person. G-resin. Re-person. From what depth is re-nonsense? "Woof," said the dog. A rush and a shuffle, and whoosh-woof went the door. Couple of inches taller. Pink-rimmed glasses. New, heaped-up hairdo, new ears. How simple. The moment, the death I had kept conjuring up for 3 years was as simple as a bit of dry wood. She was frankly and hugely pregnant. Her head looked smaller, only 2 seconds had passed really, but let me give them as much wooden duration as life can stand, and her pale freckled cheeks were hollowed, and her bare shins and arms had lost all their tan, so that the little hairs showed. She wore a brown, sleeveless cotton dress and sloppy felt slippers. "Well." She exhaled after a pause with all the emphasis of wonder and welcome. "Husband at home?" I croaked, fist in pocket. I could not kill her, of course, as some have thought. You see, I loved her. It was love at first sight, at last sight, at ever and ever sight. "Come in," she said with a vehement cheerful note. Against the splintery deadwood of the door, Dolly Schiller flattened herself as best she could, even rising on tiptoe a little, to let me pass, and was crucified for a moment, looking down, smiling down at the threshold, hollow-cheeked with round pummets, her watered milk-white arms outspread on the wood. I passed without touching her bulging babe. Dolly smell, with a faint fried addition. My teeth chattered like an idiot's. "No, you stay out," to the dog. She closed the door and followed me and her belly into the dollhouse parlor. "Dick's down there," she said, pointing with an invisible tennis racket, inviting my gaze to travel from the drab parlor bedroom where we stood, right across the kitchen, and through the back doorway where, in a rather primitive vista, a dark-haired young stranger in overalls, instantaneously reprieved, was perched with his back to me on a ladder fixing something near or upon the shack of his neighbor, a plumper fellow with only one arm, who stood looking up. This pattern she explained from afar, apologetically. Men will be men, should she call him in? No. Standing in the middle of the slanting room and emitting questioning hums, she made familiar Javanese gestures with her wrists and hands, offering me, in a brief display of humorous courtesy, to choose between a rocker and the divan, their bed after 10 p.m. I say familiar because one day she had welcomed me with the same wrist dance to her party in Beardsley. We both sat down on the divan. Curious, although actually her looks had faded, I definitely realized, so hopelessly late in the day, how much she had always looked like Botticelli's russet Venus, the same soft nose, the same blurred beauty. In my pocket my fingers gently let go and repacked a little at the tip, within the handkerchief it was nested in, my unused weapon. "That's not the fellow I want," I said. The diffuse look of welcome left her eyes. Her forehead puckered as in the old bitter days. Not who? Where is he? Quick. Look, she said, inclining her head to one side and shaking it in that position. Look, you are not going to bring that up. I certainly am, I said, and for a moment, strangely enough, the only merciful, endurable one in the whole interview, we were bristling at each other as if she were still mine. A wise girl, she controlled herself. Dick did not know a thing of the whole mess. He thought I was her father. He thought she had run away from an upper-class home just to wash dishes in a diner. He believed anything. Why should I want to make things harder than they were by raking up all that muck? But, I said, she must be sensible, she must be a sensible girl, with her bare drum under that thin brown stuff. She must understand that if she expected the help I had come to give, I must have at least a clear comprehension of the situation. Come, his name. She thought I had guessed long ago. It was, with a mischievous and melancholy smile, such a sensational name. I would never believe it. She could hardly believe it herself. His name, my fall nymph. It was so unimportant, she said. She suggested I skip it. Would I like a cigarette? No. His name. She shook her head with great resolution. She guessed it was too late to raise hell and I would never believe the unbelievably unbelievable. I said I had better go. Regards, nice to have seen her. She said really it was useless, she would never tell, but on the other hand, after all, do you really want to know who it was? Well, it wasn't. Softly, confidentially, arching her thin eyebrows and puckering her parched lips, she emitted, a little mockingly, somewhat fastidiously, not untenderly, in a kind of muted whistle, the name that the astute reader has guessed long ago. What a proof! Why did a flash from Hourglass Lake cross my consciousness? I, too, had known it, without knowing it, all along. There was no shock, no surprise. Quietly the fusion took place, and everything fell into order, into the pattern of branches that I have woven throughout this memoir with the express purpose of having the ripe fruit fall at the right moment. Yes, with the express and perverse purpose of rendering. She was talking, but I sat melting in my golden piece of rendering that golden and monstrous piece through the satisfaction of logical recognition, which my most inimical reader should experience now. She was, as I say, talking. It now came in a relaxed flow. He was the only man she had ever been crazy about. What about Dick? Oh, Dick was a lamb. They were quite happy together, but she meant something different. And I had never counted, of course. She considered me as if grasping all at once the incredible and somehow tedious, confusing and unnecessary fact that the distant, elegant, slender, 40-year-old valetudinarian in velvet coat sitting beside her had known and adored every pore and follicle of her pubescent body. In her washed-out gray eyes, strangely spectacled, our poor romance was for a moment reflected, pondered upon, and dismissed like a dull party, like a rainy picnic to which only the dullest bores had come, like a humdrum exercise, like a bit of dry mud caking her childhood. I just managed to jerk my knee out of the range of a sketchy tap, one of her acquired gestures. She asked me not to be dense. The past was the past. I had been a good father, she guessed, granting me that. Proceed, Dolly Schiller. Well, did I know that he had known her mother? That he was practically an old friend? That he had visited with his uncle in Ramsdale years ago and spoken at Mother's Club, and had tugged and pulled her, Dolly, by her bare arm onto his lap in front of everybody, and kissed her face. She was 10 and furious with him? Did I know he had seen me and her at the inn where he was writing the very play she was to rehearse in Beardsley, 2 years later? Did I know it had been horrid of her to sidetrack me into believing that Clara was an old female, maybe a relative of his or a sometime life-mate, and oh, what a close shave it had been when the Waste Journal carried his picture. The Bryceland Gazette had not. Yes, very amusing. Yes, she said, this world was just one gag after another. If somebody wrote up her life nobody would ever believe it. At this point, there came brisk homey sounds from the kitchen into which Dick and Bill had lumbered in quest of beer. Through the doorway they noticed the visitor, and Dick entered the parlor. "Dick, this is my dad!" cried Dolly in a resounding violent voice that struck me as a totally strange, and new, and cheerful, and old, and sad, because the young fellow, veteran of a remote war, was hard of hearing. Arctic blue eyes, black hair, ruddy cheeks, unshaven chin. We shook hands. Discreet Bill, who evidently took pride in working wonders with one hand, brought in the beer cans he had opened. Wanted to withdraw. The exquisite courtesy of simple folks. Was made to stay. A beer ad. In point of fact, I preferred it that way, and so did the Sillers. I switched to the jittery rocker. Avidly munching, Dilly plied me with marshmallows and potato chips. The men looked at her fragile, frilux, diminutive, old world, youngish but sickly, father in velvet coat and beige vest, maybe a viscount. They were under the impression I had come to stay, and Dick, with a great wrinkling of brows that denoted difficult thought, suggested Dolly and he might sleep in the kitchen on a spare mattress. I waved a light hand and told Dolly, who transmitted it by means of a special shout to Dick, that I had merely dropped in on my way to Reedsburg, where I was to be entertained by some friends and admirers. It was then noticed that one of the few thumbs remaining to Bill was bleeding, not such a wonder worker after all. How womanish and somehow never seen that way before was the shadowy division between her pale breasts when she bent down over the man's hand. She took him for repairs to the kitchen. For a few minutes, 3 or 4 little eternities which positively welled with artificial warmth, Dick and I remained alone. He sat on a hard chair rubbing his forelimbs and frowning. I had an idle urge to squeeze out the blackheads on the wings of his perspiring nose with my long agate claws. He had nice sad eyes with beautiful lashes, and very white teeth. His Adam's apple was large and hairy. Why don't they shave better, those young brawny chaps? He and his Dolly had had unrestrained intercourse on that couch there, at least 180 times, probably much more, and before that how long had she known him? No grudge. Funny, no grudge at all, nothing except grief and nausea. He was now rubbing his nose. I was sure that when finally he would open his mouth, he would say, slightly shaking his head, "Oh, she's a swell kid, Mr. Haze. She sure is. And she's going to make a swell mother." He opened his mouth and took a sip of beer. This gave him countenance, and he went on sipping till he frothed at the mouth. He was a lamb. He had cupped her Florentine breasts. His fingernails were black and broken, but the phalanges, the whole carpus, the strong shapely wrist were far, far finer than mine. I have hurt too many bodies with my twisted poor hands to be proud of them. French epithets, a Dorset yokel's knuckles, an Austrian tailor's flat fingertips. That's Humbert Humbert. Good. If he was silent I could be silent too. Indeed, I could very well do with a little rest in this subdued, frightened to death rocking chair, before I drove to wherever the beast's lair was, and then pulled the pistol's foreskin back, and then enjoyed the orgasm of the crushed trigger. I was always a good little follower of the Viennese medicine man. But presently I became sorry for poor Dick, whom, in some hypnotoid way, I was horribly preventing from making the only remark he could think up, "She's a swell kid." "And so," I said, "you're going to Canada?" In the kitchen, Dolly was laughing at something Bill had said or done. "And so," I shouted, "you're going to Canada?" "Not Canada," I re-shouted, "I mean Alaska, of course." He nursed his glass and, nodding sagely, replied, "Well, he cut it on a Jagger, I guess. Lost his right arm in Italy. Lovely mauve almond trees in bloom. A blown-off surrealistic arm hanging up there in the pointillistic mauve. A flower girl tattoo on the hand." Dolly and band-aided Bill reappeared. It occurred to me that her ambiguous, brown and pale beauty excited the cripple. Dick, with a grin of relief, stood up. He guessed Bill and he would be going back to fix those wires. He guessed Mr. Haze and Dolly had loads of things to say to each other. He guessed he would be seeing me before I left. Why do those people guess so much and shave so little, and are so disdainful of hearing aids? "Sit down," she said, audibly striking her flanks with her palms. I relapsed into the black rocker. "So you betrayed me?" Where did you go? Where is he now? She took from the mantelpiece a concave glossy snapshot. Old woman in white, stout, beaming, bow-legged, very short dress, old man in his shirt sleeves, drooping mustache, watch chain. Her in-laws. Living with Dick's brother's family in Juneau. Sure you don't want to smoke? She was smoking herself. First time I saw her doing it. String verboten under Humbert the Terrible. Gracefully, in a blue mist, Charlotte Haze rose from her grave. I would find him through Uncle Ivory if she refused. Betrayed you? No. She directed the dart of her cigarette, index rapidly tapping upon it, toward the hearth exactly as her mother used to do, and then, like her mother, oh my God, with her fingernail scratched and removed a fragment of cigarette paper from her underlip. No. She had not betrayed me. I was among friends. Edessa had warned her that Q liked little girls, had been almost jailed once, in fact, nice fact, and he knew she knew. Yes. Elbow in palm, puff, smile, exhaled smoke, darting gesture. Waxing reminiscent. He saw smiling through everything and everybody, because he was not like me and her but a genius. A great guy. Full of fun. Had rocked with laughter when she confessed about me and her, and said he had thought so. It was quite safe, under the circumstances, to tell him. Well, Q they all called him Q her camp 5 years ago. Curious coincidence. Took her to a dude ranch about a day's drive from Elphinstone. Named? Oh, some silly name Duck Ranch, you know, just plain silly, but it did not matter now, anyway, because the place had vanished and disintegrated. Really, she meant, I could not imagine how utterly lush that ranch was. She meant it had everything but everything, even an indoor waterfall. Did I remember the red-haired guy we was good, had once had some tennis with? Well, the place really belonged to Red's brother, but he had turned it over to Q for the summer. When Q and she came, the others had them actually go through a coronation ceremony and then a terrific ducking, as when you cross the equator. You know. Her eyes rolled in synthetic resignation. Go on, please. Well, the idea was he would take her in September to Hollywood and arrange a tryout for her, a bit part in the tennis match scene of a movie picture based on a play of his Golden Guts, and perhaps even have her double one of its sensational starlets on the Klieg-struck tennis court. Alas, it never came to that. Where is the hog now? He was not a hog. He was a great guy in many respects. But it was all drink and drugs. And, of course, he was a complete freak in sex matters, and his friends were his slaves. I just could not imagine, Humbert, could not imagine, what they all did at Duck Ranch. She refused to take part because she loved him, and he threw her out. What things? Oh, weird, filthy, fancy things. I mean, he had 2 girls and 2 boys, and 3 or 4 men, and the idea was for all of us to tangle in the nude while an old woman took movie pictures. Sade's Justine was 12 at the start. What things exactly? Oh, things. Oh, she uttered the I as a subdued cry while she listened to the source of the ache, and for lack of words spread the 5 fingers of her angularly up and down moving hand. No, she gave it up. She refused to go into particulars with that baby inside her. That made sense. It is of no importance now, she said, pounding a gray cushion with her fist and then lying back, belly up, on the divan. Crazy things, filthy things. I said no, I'm just not going to, she used, in all insouciance. Really? A disgusting slang term which, in a literal French translation, would be souffleur, your beastly boys, because I want only you. Well, he kicked me out. There was not much else to tell. That winter 1949, Faye and she had found jobs. For almost 2 years she had just drifted, doing some restaurant work in small places, and then she had met Dick. No, she did not know where the other was. In New York, she guessed. Of course, he was so famous she would have found him at once if she had wanted. Faye had tried to get back to the ranch and it just was not there anymore. It had burned to the ground, nothing remained, just a charred heap of rubbish. It was so strange she closed her eyes and opened her mouth, leaning back on the cushion, one felted foot on the floor. The wooden floor slanted, a little steel bowl would have rolled into the kitchen. I knew all I wanted to know. I had no intention of torturing my darling. Somewhere beyond Bill's shack an after-work radio had begun singing of folly and fate, and there she was with her ruined looks and her adult, rope-vein narrow hands and her goose-flesh white arms, and her shallow ears, and her unkempt armpits. There she was, my Lolita, hopelessly worn at 17, with that baby, dreaming already in her of becoming a big shot and retiring around 2028. And I looked and looked at her, and knew as clearly as I know I am to die, that I loved her more than anything I had ever seen or imagined on earth, or hoped for anywhere else. She was only the faint violet whiff and dead leaf echo of the nymph that I had rolled myself upon with such cries in the past, an echo on the brink of a russet ravine, with a far wood under a white sky, and brown leaves choking the brook, and one last cricket in the crisp weeds. But thank God it was not that echo alone that I worshipped. What I used to pamper among the tangled vines of my heart, mon grand pêche redux, had dwindled to its essence, sterile and selfish vice, all that I cancelled and cursed. You may jeer at me, and threaten to clear the court, but until I am gagged and half-throttled, I will shout my poor truth. I insist the world know how much I loved my Lolita, this Lolita, pale and polluted, and big with another's child, but still grey-eyed, still sooty-lashed, still auburn and almond, still Carmencita, still mine, changes de vie, ma Carmen, Bellens vivre quelque part où nous n'y serons jamais séparés, Ohio. The wilds of Massachusetts? No matter, even if those eyes of hers would fade to myopic fish, and her nipples swell and crack, and her lovely young velvety delicate delta be tainted and torn, even then I would go mad with tenderness at the mere sight of your dear wan face, at the mere sound of your raucous young voice, my Lolita. Lolita, I said, this may be neither here nor there, but I have to say it. Life is very short. From here to that old car you know so well there is a stretch of 25 paces. It is a very short walk. Make those 25 steps. Now. Right now. Come just as you are. And we shall live happily ever after. Carmen, voulez-vous venir avec moi? You mean, she said, opening her eyes and raising herself slightly, the snake that may strike, you mean you will give us, that money only if I go with you to a motel? Is that what you mean? No, I said, you got it all wrong. I want you to leave your incidental dick, and this awful hole, and come to live with me, and die with me, and everything with me, words to that effect. You're crazy, she said, her features working. Think it over, Lolita. There are no strings attached. Except, perhaps, well, no matter. A reprieve, I wanted to say but did not. Anyway, if you refuse you will still get your trousseau. No kidding? Asked Dolly. I handed her an envelope with $400 in cash and a check for $3,600 more. Gingerly, uncertainly, she received mon petit cadeau, and then her forehead became a beautiful pink. You mean, she said, with agonized emphasis, you are giving us $4,000? I covered my face with my hand and broke into the hottest tears I had ever shed. I felt them winding through my fingers and down my chin, and burning me, and my nose got clogged, and I could not stop, and then she touched my wrist. I'll die if you touch me, I said. You are sure you are not coming with me? Is there no hope of your coming? Tell me only this. No, she said. No, honey, no. She had never called me honey before. No, she said, it is quite out of the question. I would sooner go back to Q. I mean, she groped for words. I supplied them mentally. He broke my heart. You merely broke my life. I think, she went on. Oops, the envelope skidded to the floor. She picked it up. I think it's so utterly grand of you to give us all that dough. It settles everything. We can start next week. Stop crying, please. You should understand. Let me get you some more beer. Oh, don't cry. I'm so sorry I cheated so much, But that's the way things are. I wiped my face and my fingers. She smiled at the cat. She exulted. She wanted to call Dick. I said I would have to leave in a moment, did not want to see him at all, at all. We tried to think of some subject of conversation. For some reason, I kept seeing it trembled and silkily glowed on my damn retina, a radiant child of 12, sitting on a threshold, pinging pebbles at an empty can. I almost said, trying to find some casual remark, I wonder sometimes what has become of the little Mku girl, did she ever get better? But stopped in time lest she rejoin, I wonder sometimes what has become of the little Haze girl. Finally, I reverted to money matters. That sum, I said, represented more or less the net rent from her mother's house, she said, had it not been sold years ago? No, I admit I had told her this in order to sever all connections with a lawyer would send a full account of the financial situation later. It was rosy, some of the small securities her mother had owned had gone up and up. Yes, I was quite sure I had to go. I had to go, and find him, and destroy him. Since I would not have survived the touch of her lips, I kept retreating in a mincing dance, at every step she and her belly made toward me. She and the dog saw me off. I was surprised, this a rhetorical figure, I was not, that the sight of the old car in which she had ridden as a child and an infant, left her so very indifferent. All she remarked was it was getting sort of purplish about the gills. I said it was hers, I could go by bus. She said don't be silly, they would fly to Jupiter and buy a car there. I said I would buy this one from her for $500. At this rate we'll be millionaires next, she said to the ecstatic dog. Carmencita, Louis demandis G. One last word, I said in my horrible careful English, are you quite sure that not tomorrow, of course, and not after tomorrow, but someday, any day, you will not come to live with me? I will create a brand new god and thank him with piercing cries, if you give me that microscopic hope, to that effect. No, she said smiling, no. It would have made all the difference, said Humbert Humbert. Then I pulled out my automatic. This is the kind of fool thing a reader might suppose I did. It never even occurred to me to do it. Goodbye. She changed, my American sweet immortal dead love, for she is dead and immortal if you are reading this. Such is the formal agreement with the so-called authorities. Then, as I drove away, I heard her shout in a vibrant voice to her Dick, and the dog started to lope alongside my car like a fat dolphin, but he was too heavy and old, and very soon gave up. And presently I was driving through the drizzle of the dying day, with the windshield wipers in full action but unable to cope with my tears. 30. Leaving as I did Colmont around 4 in the afternoon, by route X I do not remember the number, I might have made Ransdale by dawn had not a shortcut tempted me. I had to get on to Highway Y. My map showed quite blandly that just beyond Woodbine, which I reached at nightfall, I could leave paved X and reached paved Y by means of a transverse dirt road. It was only some 40 miles long according to my map. Otherwise I would have to follow X for another 100 miles and then use leisurely looping Z to get to Y in my destination. However, the shortcut in question got worse and worse, bumpier and bumpier, muddier and muddier, and when I attempted to turn back after some 10 miles of purblind, tortuous and tortoise-slow progress, my old and weak Melmoth got stuck in deep clay. All was dark and muggy, and hopeless. My headlights hung over a broad ditch full of water. The surrounding country, if any, was a black wilderness. I sought to extricate myself but my rear wheels only whined in slush and anguish. Cursing my plight, I took off my fancy clothes, changed into slacks, pulled on the bullet-riddled sweater, and waded 4 miles back to a roadside farm. It started to rain on the way but I had not the strength to go back for a mackintosh. Such incidents have convinced me that my heart is basically sound despite recent diagnoses. Around midnight, a wrecker dragged my car out. I navigated back to Highway X and traveled on. Utter weariness overtook me an hour later, in an anonymous little town. I pulled up at the curb and in darkness drank deep from a friendly flask. The rain had been cancelled miles before. It was a black warm night, somewhere in Appalachia. Now and then cars passed me, red tail lights receding, white headlights advancing, but the town was dead. Nobody strolled and laughed on the sidewalks as relaxing burghers would in sweet, mellow, rotting Europe. I was alone to enjoy the innocent night and my terrible thoughts. A wire receptacle on the curb was very particular about acceptable contents, sweepings. Paper. No garbage. Cherry red letters of light marked a camera shop. A large thermometer with the name of a laxative quietly dwelt on the front of a drugstore. Rubinov's jewelry company had a display of artificial diamonds reflected in a red mirror. A lighted green clock swam in the line steps of Jiffy Jeff Laundry. On the other side of the street a garage said in its sleep genuflection lubricity, and corrected itself to Gulflex lubrication. An airplane, also gemmed by Rubinov, passed, droning, in the velvet heavens. How many small dead-of-night towns I had seen! This was not yet the last. Let me dally a little, he is as good as destroyed. Some way further across the street, neon lights flickered twice slower than my heart. The outline of a restaurant sign, a large coffee pot, kept bursting, every full second or so, into emerald life, and every time it went out, pink letters saying fine foods relate it, but the pot could still be made out as a latent shadow teasing the eye before its next emerald resurrection. We made shadowgraphs. This furtive burg was not far from the enchanted hunters. I was weeping again, drunk on the impossible past.